What's up everybody, Rob here. So this is a very off-the-cuff video that I'm putting together. This is something that's inspired by a series of questions that were asked to me on a previous video, and they have to do with the Mongols. Now specifically, the question that was asked was, how would the Mongols fare against the Spanish Tercio? And the answer to that, in my opinion at least, is that the Spanish Tercio would have a pretty hard time of dealing with the Mongols, at least at their height. And we're also talking about an open field battle here. We're not talking about an ambush or anything like that, or something where there's, say, mountains or rivers in the way, something that prevents the Mongols from using their mobility to the maximum possible degree. So my initial reaction was, yeah, the Tercio would be shredded pretty quickly, but then I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, at this point, really steppe peoples sort of faded away. I mean, they were around even into the 20th century, and there's still nomadic peoples around today. But by the time of the Spanish Tercio in the 16th century, they really had stopped being an existential threat to Europe or really any other civilization. Yes, they would continue to raid along sparsely populated frontier settlements, but really, for the most part, they were no longer this massive juggernaut, which had plagued armies going back for millennia. So, well, what happened? Well, a bunch of things. So unlike most of my videos, which are basically just informational, this is more of speculation on my part. Now, I am not an expert on this subject. I am at best an enthusiastic amateur, and so take whatever I say with a grain of salt, but hey, it's fun to speculate every now and then. So, without any further ado, steppe peoples. What made them lose their dominance? So the steppe is a wide swath of land covering Eurasia from Hungary all the way through to eastern China, almost to Korea. While there are some geographic features such as mountains, rivers, and lakes, mostly it is an almost endless sea of open, flat grassland with some slight rolling hills, but otherwise it's just this flat, open plain with grassland as far as the eye can see. This area of the world was populated by a host of nomadic peoples throughout history, most famously the Mongols and the Huns, but also the Magyars, the Avars, Scythians, Sarmatians, Turks, and just a whole bunch of others. These people were mostly nomadic pastoralists, which means that they would be constantly roaming throughout the region and coming into contact with other tribes, as well as the civilized people, and I use the term civilized very loosely here, who lived on the periphery. Now, although the names have changed from Scythian to Mongol and everything else in between, the main method of warfare was pretty much unchanged for millennia. And that, of course, is the horse archer, which is a weapon system that integrates the speed and mobility of a horse, specifically steppe horses, which are smaller, lighter, faster. They are almost tireless, especially compared to larger breeds of horses, and the range capabilities of composite bows. And it was the integration of these two things, the horse and the bow, that gave the steppe peoples a massive advantage over more settled peoples. Probably the most famous example of this was the Battle of Carrhae, where Parthians just ripped apart 7 Roman legions. And yes, I am eventually going to be making a point here. Now, settled peoples generally did not use ranged equipment all that much, comparatively speaking. If you look at the Romans, for example, at Carrhae, the number of Romans who were equipped with ranged weapons was infinitesimally small. I mean, less than, I think, 10%. I'm just coming up with these numbers off the top of my head. The Romans themselves were not particularly known for their ranged combat. Yes, they did have the pilum, but, that hardly counts, especially in circumstances like this. The bulk of the Roman forces were made up of heavy infantry, with their large shields and their gladiuses. Gladii, however you pluralize that. In any case, the tradition of having infantry as the core of the army in European context pretty much stayed the same throughout, the rest of antiquity into the Middle Ages. That was the standard way to go. The bulk of your army would be close combat, usually spear-armed, but not always, melee-equipped infantrymen with a detachment of cavalry, and there would be, of course, some archers, but again, these ranged units would make up a very small proportion of the total numbers. Usually anywhere between 10 and 20%, though there are exceptions to this. For example, the English actually had an inverse where the bulk of their armies, at least in the later Middle Ages, 100 Years' War era, Wars of the Roses era, there would be a 6-to-1 longbow to foot soldier ratio, so sometimes even as much as a 10-to-1, so there'd be a lot of archers in England at this time period, or into the Middle Ages, and that of course is the exception that proves the rule. However, overall in most European contexts, a typical European field army would have the bulk of its forces as infantry. I'm not too familiar with China, however, they also did have a large portion of their army as infantry. So again, I don't know the exact numbers and proportions involved. I'm not really as familiar with Chinese warfare, but we're looking at somewhat of a similar situation. So in a contest between close-quarter melee-style infantry, say spear-armed infantry, and horse archers, mobile horse archers like the Mongols or the Huns or whatever group you're talking about here, the advantage in an open field battle would go to the horse archers. I think that goes without saying. They can hit at range and just pick apart their opponents. I mean, Battle of Carrhae. We all know what happened there. This would change in the late Middle Ages with the introduction of gunpowder. Now, gunpowder actually had been around for some time before this. The Chinese invented it. First, originally, it was more of a novelty, and eventually its military applications became useful mostly for things like rockets and that sort of thing. But once it made it to Europe, incidentally brought to Europe by the Mongols, bit of an ironic twist there, the military applications of gunpowder really took off, specifically in the form of artillery and in the form of personal firearms. As the technology improved from hand culverins and hand cannons to matchlock muskets and then eventually into flintlock muskets, a higher proportion of soldiers would be equipped with these weapons. Ranged units, which used to take up a small percentage of the army, say 10 to 20% or thereabouts, suddenly became close to half, and then only increased from there as the centuries wore on. So, whereas before the settled peoples in a field battle would have to just sit there basically and take it, like, again, look at Carrhae, the Romans basically formed up a giant box formation, and they just sat there and let the Parthians rain arrows on them, and there's really not much more they could have done at that point. Now it gave them an ability to at least shoot back. And I know what you're thinking. Well, muskets versus bows, well, the bow is vastly superior. It has a higher rate of fire, you can shoot a further range with it, and it is much more accurate. And yes, that is true, but at least these settled peoples could shoot back, as opposed to just sitting there, which, again, they maybe weren't shooting back as well, but they were at least, shooting back at all. And we've been talking about open field battles up to this point, but there's more to warfare than just that. Specifically, I'm talking about siege warfare and attacking settled locations. Cannons mounted on a city wall would be an effective defense against marauding raiders. Steppe nomads always had issues with siege warfare, and with the advent of cannons, it became next to impossible. Now, the logistics that were required to use these gunpowder weapons made it very difficult for settled peoples to go after the nomads, especially in nomads' territory, but at least their own settlements could be safe from nomadic incursions. And likewise, the logistics are required to manufacture gunpowder weapons, specifically cannons, but also muskets as well, required a settled people to do so. You needed foundries and forges, you need tons of charcoal and other types of fuel, you needed basically this massive infrastructure. Gunpowder requires, basically chemistry, something that can't really be done, at least not on a large scale, in a nomad's tent. So I guess this is a very elaborate way of saying the adoption of gunpowder weaponry, although not as effective, at least gave settled people a chance to actually shoot back at their opponents. And maybe if settled peoples had relied more on ranged weaponry, such as like the English, like I said before, who relied very heavily on the longbow, if there was a cultural emphasis on ranged weaponry as opposed to close quarter weaponry, the effectiveness of steppe peoples would have been dramatically different, at least in my opinion. And it took the widespread adoption of ranged weaponry to really shift the balance of power in the favor of the settled peoples. And I just want to take this opportunity to talk about the Huns and more specifically the Mongols and how they were able to achieve the levels of success they did. And yes, other steppe peoples were successful as well, but particularly the Mongols and to a lesser extent the Huns. They were able to do considerable damage and actually were an existential threat to multiple empires, including the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, much of China, and pretty much the Khwarezmian Empire. But the Mongols just pretty much trounced everybody, more or less. Anyway, those were really the exception rather than the rule. And the reason why is that in the vast open steppe lands, these different tribes and groups were oftentimes at war with each other. And the settled peoples that were around them would take advantage of this. The Byzantines did it, and the Chinese were really good at this. When you would have a particular warlord that was gaining in prominence and becoming more and more powerful and gaining influence, they would go to this guy's rivals and they would say, hey, look, we got a bunch of stuff here. See, like, we're settled people. We have silks. We have metalworking, much better than what you got. We got, later on in, the Russians actually did this as well with gunpowder weaponry that, again, like we've established, the steppe peoples couldn't manufacture. Look, we'll give you all this really cool stuff here. We'll pay you. We got gold. We got silver. We got all this really nice stuff. And what we're going to do, what I just need you to do is take your army and see that guy over there? He's gaining power and influence. Yeah, if you could just take him out, that'd be fantastic. And basically the Chinese did this really, really well. The Byzantines did it as well. and the Russians also did so too. And well, pretty much all of the settled peoples living on the periphery of the steppe lands did it, but especially those civilizations there. And because of this, by playing one tribe or one group off against the other, they were able to keep the steppe peoples from uniting under a single banner. Now, the exception to this, of course, were the Huns and especially the Mongols. And again, there were some other, others here and there, but mostly those two. But they came about at a time when the surrounding settled peoples were having a bit of a hard time. So, for example, the Huns showed up at the later stages of antiquity when the Roman Empire was already split at that point between the eastern and the western half and was not in the best of shape. So, there was a bunch of internal problems, and there were also external attacks from the Alemanni, the Goths, and the Alans, and a bunch of other peoples, incidentally, that were continually being pushed west by the Huns. Also, when the Mongols under Genghis Khan were rising in prominence, it was at a time when the Chinese were having a bunch of internal problems as well. Whoever was in charge of the Chinese intelligence services really dropped the ball at that point, and they really didn't notice this Temujin guy who was uniting all these Mongol tribes, conquering one after the other, and bringing them under a single banner. They were unable to play the normal game of playing one tribe against the other, and things just sort of snowballed. Now, like I said before, steppe peoples were never particularly good at siege warfare. This really was no different, even under Genghis Khan. You might say, but the Mongols conducted sieges all the time. They were really good at siege warfare. Well, no, they weren't. They were really good at taking Chinese engineers and forcing them to conduct sieges on their behalf. The Mongols were also extremely successful because of the rigid discipline that Genghis Khan imposed on his people. They would be arranged, instead of according to tribal lines of the various Mongol tribes that he had brought under his banner, they would be arranged according to a decimal system. And promotions would be based on merit. There would be very strict punishments, and overall he made a very rigid and very tightly controlled, disciplined military force. Something that was very, very unusual amongst the steppe people. So I know it's sort of passé now in the historical communities to use the great man theory of history, but I'm going to do it anyway. The idea of the great man theory is that history is pushed around by the actions of a few great men. Very exceptional individuals who basically impose their will on the society around them, and they shape history just by the force of their action. That's kind of falling out of favor. Most people favor what's now known as the trends and forces theory, which basically means that if there wasn't a Genghis Khan himself specifically, somebody else would have done the same thing. The various political, social, economic, environmental factors would have created a Genghis Khan factor, whether or not Temujin had been born at all. I don't necessarily believe that. Of course, history is a bit of both, trends and forces versus the great man theory. It's somewhere in between. But specifically, though, you had to have a particularly exceptional individual like Genghis Khan or like Attila the Hun to take advantage of the forces and trends. They happened to arrive at a time when their enemies, the Chinese or the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire too, were at a particular low point. This was advantageous for them, and they were able to capitalize on their enemies' weaknesses. It took exceptional individuals such as Genghis Khan to be able to form these disparate tribes into a single unified force, but at the same time, he was also aided by the internal weaknesses of his enemies, and Attila basically did the same thing. And one has to wonder, I know this is speculative history, and who knows what we're talking about here, but what if, say, the Huns had showed up at the height of Rome's power? Would they have done as much damage, or would they just be a footnote? Oh yeah, this was a barbarian tribe that showed up, and Emperor Trajan just trounced them. Or what if it was at the height of Chinese power, and they saw that the Mongols were gaining influence, and they just basically sowed division amongst them, and everything fell apart. They were able to do what they did mostly because of external factors outside of their control. So really, this is just a very long-winded, very roundabout way of me saying that in my opinion at least, the existential threat that was posed by the steppe peoples, particularly in the form of the Mongols and to a lesser extent the Huns and others as well, was mostly due to the divisions of the settled peoples that they were attacking. Yes, Genghis Khan was a very exceptional individual, but he also happened to be born and happened to rule during a particularly advantageous time. So that's pretty much it for the video. Just a little bit of idle speculation on my part here. It was a bit long-winded, more than I would have hoped, but it's me we're talking about here. You kind of have to expect these things from me. Any case, please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it, and have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're adults, you can have any kind of day you want. See you later.